Hey guys, I know it's been a while since I had one of these videos, and I think I just want to get back into doing them more regularly again. As I get back into event running and bring you guys different experiences, just a chance to talk through some of the stuff that we're going to be doing or we tried, things that worked, things that didn't work. In this particular case, obviously we had Summer Uprising back on August 16th. I was very happy with how, as a like kind of a test event, it went. There was also a story to it, and so I figured that not everyone has a lot of time to always read through everything we write, and so for anyone who's sitting around and just want to have a listen to kind of what happened at the game from a story perspective, I'm just going to read off what we have here, as well as I'm going to get into the scores as well a little bit after we're done going through the story bit piece. It was a very close event and was really kind of again some great sportsmanship there. Very proud of what the Commanders were able to do with what was essentially um, a very light nil sim event. We did not have a lot of structure for them to work with, aside from kind of giving the heads up they should have their own cadre. And from your guys' perspective, showing up and taking orders and listening and kind of playing along with that worked really well for at least that sort of test game involving walk-on players, everything else. We will be changing that up in future events, but we wanted to see how that would work because we've never really tried mixing those two things together before, and it's really just kind of getting people back into the mindset of these kinds of games. We're always going to try and make them fun, not super serious in the sense of extremely structured, but trying to kind of like get the best of both worlds, right? Airsoft is more than a hobby necessarily than it is a sport most of the time, and we want to kind of like hone in on those experiences, like making sure everyone gets a chance to do something cool at the game that they can talk about, and build on or create their own storyline from. Um, Anyways, I'll stop rambling here and get into the summary. This is something I wrote up based off of the actual events of the game, kind of broken down into, it's still a little bit of a longer form read, but it's not like the full breadth of detail. It's just enough to kind of like take what happened and, compartmentalize it into how that worked out from, the grander scheme of things. Like this is a science fiction game, so it takes place on a colony world. There's three other colonies, and there's Earth, and they're all under the Terran Authority, excuse me, Terran Federal Authority, or the TFA. And those rebels are, essentially, you know, whether it's a tax issue or regulation issue or in general support from the government, in terms of how they're treating these colonies, there's at least perceived to be a lot of problems, and there has been a lot of murmurs of an uprising up until the point of this event. Which, of course, this game is the spark, the first colony that is basically saying no more. So, without further ado, I will jump into just reading to you what I'll be posting as well. So, here we go. So, as the TFA made planetfall, the rebels had already begun distributing their weapons. The time had come, and the mixture of disillusioned workers, fed up police, and former colonial militia knew they all had to work together to make a stand. Their first objective was to capture a local communication structure to try and get the word out to the other colonies that a revolution was starting. However, the TFA were already prepared for this and had swiftly moved in the opening minutes to contain any spread of rebel divisiveness and made it their only objective. The rebels countered by probing areas around the spaceport, sporadically causing TFA casualties, but the initial splintered approach did not deter the TFA from locking down all communications. At the same time, a Halcon Minerals survey flight sent out an automated distress signal, followed by a mid-air explosion. Only two parachutes were visible floating to the planet's surface. Although locked in a bloody struggle over the surrounding colony structures, the debris and parachutes caught both sides' attention, with the surviving mechanic located by the rebels and the pilot by the TFA. Halcon, traditionally, is well regarded across the systems due to its fair negotiating and spotless safety record. However, they are protective of their employees, so neither the TFA or the rebels considered any options beyond finding a way to return the wayward crew. That said, The rebels took the opportunity to question the mechanic to give the impression that they would need something in return for relaying to Halcon for a handoff. The mechanic, who at this point was suffering from a severe concussion and in general appeared delirious, did manage to reveal data from the doomed flight. After which, the rebels received word from Halcon that they contracted Black Tide to retrieve the mechanic at the impact site. We'll get into Black Tide later in terms of what they are. Think of them as a search and rescue team in this specific scenario. Meanwhile, the TFA worked for several minutes to stabilize the severely injured pilot and did also retrieve survey data before also attempting to move the pilot to a rendezvous point with the Black Tide. However, in a bold move by the rebels, the TFA units found themselves entirely blocked from reaching the rescue team. As their time was limited, Black Tide wrote off the pilot as an acceptable loss, due to them having one survivor in decent health to relay whatever information Halcon may want to know. Halcon is supposedly evaluating whether to contract Black Tide with such contracts in the future. Black Tide Corporate, on the other hand, relayed to its team that after packaging and sending its contract back into orbit, that additional synergistic opportunities could be established in the rapidly changing market that is Halcyon. Although the rebellion could dampen outside investments, Black Tide understands that it has to be flexible in macroeconomic conditions and therefore prepared for any eventuality. As such, both commanders received an offer of assistance with moving items off the colony if either were interested. The value of anything specialized in an open war zone is debatable when both sides are indiscriminately blowing each other up. However, for the rebels to sneak items to their contacts on other colonies to prepare for more uprisings only puts more pressure on the TFA to capitulate. For the TFA commander, it is well known that wealth is not part of the job unless you know how to manage your inventory. So, although not an ideal partner to either side, they both found themselves locked in a stalemate, with TFA controlling most of the settlement structures while the rebels continue to make the outskirts and its industrial core far too dangerous for any concentrated attack by the authorities. As such, both sides took the chance at ferrying supplies to locations noted by the Black Tide. Briefly, the TFA found the route blocked by a rebel effort to take and hold the town hall. But as the TFA applied pressure, the rebels retreated back into their own territory, however, not before taking quite a significant toll on the TFA forces that were trying to breach in, with minimal losses on their side. Throughout the entire hour, the rebels also found it difficult to make the rendezvous, finding it by the time they learned where the Black Tide were, the troopers were already moving to the next location. It wasn't until their final stop, before exiting the area, extracting all their goods obviously, that the TFA had been able to transfer them, finally did the rebels manage to broker a deal, pay off the squad commander, and get a number of general supplies out of the combat area. In all, the TFA were able to extract some of their specific items like technological pieces, as well as some of the flight logs from the Halcon flight, and some general supplies, while the rebels were mostly just general supplies to get to their contacts. Despite a media and communications blackout, predictably, word of the uprising had begun to leak out to the other three colonies, as well as Earth itself. Containment was no longer an option, but the alternative would be easier said than done. The TFA commander received a direct command from the ruling council that destruction of the colony spire would effectively make an example of the local population. This was not an ideal order. Committing such a heinous act was not what he or any of his staff had signed up for. But as he began to question whether this would only embolden the rebels, he was quickly silenced by the Brigadier General, his superior, who summed it up, "Do not mistake this as a choice, Commander. You either follow the order, or the entire colony will be destroyed. If it helps your conscience, you'll end up saving lives at the end of the day." Asking for volunteers to fire the artillery itself, of which there were only a few, the TFA manned it and began systematically shelling the upper city. In response, the rebels attempted to counterattack, desperately trying to reach the artillery, but found the majority of the TFA still ready and on the defense. As civilians fled in terror, rebel forces noticed long pauses in the barrage and used them to help evacuate as many as they could to lower sections before the next barrage occurred. Whether those long barrages were part of a reloading process or possibly purposeful, no one is to say. It's not known at this time. Simultaneously, some generators were found throughout the settlement pieces that the rebels were retaking at this time that could be used to power an old deflector shield system from when the colony was first established. With these on, the rebels were able to absorb some of their artillery hits that were hitting in the market parts of the spire. As the barrage itself came to an end, TFA forces found the rebels scattered, trying to help their own to safety. Taking this opportunity, the TFA made a last-minute push into long-held rebel territory, capturing the primary industrial structures on the outskirts. However, they quickly discovered the rebels no longer had any reason to stay out of the city. Its population now underground or dead, they would make their final stand and decide who would control the spaceport. A still motivated, but partially depleted TFA gathered its remaining force to attempt a breach of the city walls, only to find a now concentrated and motivated rebel force ready to take vengeance. Of our remaining 150, after the first half hour, only 30 TFA could be counted still desperately fighting to take the city. The rebels, taking only 40 casualties out of their remaining 80, held firm, ready to finish the TFA incursion once and for all. However, something odd stood out to both sides. Neither side's forces that entered the spaceport on the southern side of the city had been responding, and those nearby, who were still responding, reported seeing Black Tide forces holding a perimeter. It was about this time that the TFA cadre detected the activation of a significant power source within the Black Tide perimeter, a source they recognized in their experience as part of a well-known ERW implemented by Black Tide Solutions. Essentially, a neutron bomb, capable of wiping out organic life on a massive scale. Refusing communications with the TFA, the goal of Black Tide appeared to have shifted, and the TFA force was considered expendable. Both commanders now faced a choice: either hope they could wipe the other side out and then take on the highly equipped and technologically superior foe, or temporarily put aside their differences and join forces to have a better chance at survival. With the dead and wounded littering the city center, the guns slowly fell silent as both commanders quickly met to discuss their options. The specific deal is not known, but what soon followed was rebels and TFA troops flowing together towards the spaceport. It was an immediate bloodbath. The Black Tide troopers, no longer shackled by their defensive ROE, now actively engaged any who dared enter their sight. Shockingly to the newly formed alliance, troopers seemed to give little regard to small arms fire, so word spread among the fighters to send up whatever explosives were available. They formed groups, using runners as bait to take the attention of troopers, while others threw grenades, IEDs, and Molotov cocktails. One by one, the troopers began to fall, unable to handle the combined numbers of both forces. As they reached the center of the perimeter, their suspicions were confirmed. A shipping container with a glowing center was counting down. As they pushed the bodies aside, the fighters discovered that the system had one emergency shutdown, activated by a coded key. With only 2 minutes to spare, and still several Black Tide troopers in the vicinity, the only remaining hope would be to find such a key on the body of an already dead trooper, or at least they would hopefully find one. Sprinting from body to body, fighters dodged explosions and fire, flipping through the remains of the once proud troopers. It was on one, with a long cape and fur along his collar, did they find an odd-looking key that matched the code listed on the device. But their moment of success was short-lived as two troopers rounded the corner and opened fire. Many fighters were cut down as they sprinted back, but to the troopers' horror, from the other side of the container came a cloud of grenades, killing them both instantly. It is not known who had the key, but the result was a miracle. With 25 seconds remaining, the Alliance had successfully saved every living being on the colony. The TFA had failed to end the rebellion. Its vanguard force now in tatters and effectively abandoned by the government that sent it. The uprising has achieved its real first victory. And that story will be continued at the next event, probably in the summer of next year. I don't know why you shut this off. So, obviously, this was, again, an experiment of bringing back some of the massive flair, the Milsim Light event. I think we'll definitely be taking a pause on some of the mechanics, especially at the end game there, and switching them around with something else. So don't expect these games to have the same structure each time, but definitely will have the elements of these stories, these items, these things you interact with, and hopefully we'll be building up more things for them to support that. Excuse me. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm going to get into scores, which I will display on the screen and talk through them a little bit. So let me get into that now. All right, so let's jump into scores. So I broke it down into a couple different categories to try and make this straightforward. Simply, there was 3 different parts of this game. First was territorial control. Second was resource points, gathering objects and holding on to them. And then the third was the missions themselves, all 3 of which created a scoreable piece to it. On the score sheets that I will be sharing, everyone does have a breakdown here in terms of, like, say, for example, for territorial control, every point you captured had a total amount of points available. If you were to capture it from minute 1 of the event to hold it to the end, you could obtain 245 base points from that single location. Some points were scored with 2 times the point count at the end. Some were just standard, 1 point per minute. That's it. Then, of course, there was scores for the specific objectives you could achieve within an mission. I break these down here as well in terms of what you could possibly have done. And then the scoreable objectives themselves had their own point value. So from a mission standpoint, in terms of the totals here, the first mission was the holding the communication site and making transmissions. The way this was scored was basically you would control it for X number of minutes within the first hour. So you get points for that. And then on top of that, if you had a team member regularly going and shouting, propaganda for your side or some sort of psychological message or what have you from that station, that would get you additional points. So the TFA did pretty well with this one. They managed to hold it for the entirety of the mission, as well as announce multiple times some pretty good TFA propaganda. I am aware that after the mission was complete, the time which was allotted for that mission was done, that the rebels did capture it and make their own transmissions. I counted that part of the story aspect of it, not necessarily part of the mission, so there wasn't really points there to throw for that. In the next mission, the rebels did a lot better. This is the one where there was 2 pilots, well, 1 pilot, 1 mechanic on either side of the field. Both sides managed to find their target. Both sides managed to render assistance in whatever way or talk through their issues with them. Both sides were able to obtain information from them, but only the rebels were able to extract their pilot or their mechanic in this specific case out, which gained them the win on that mission. They were over by 50 points on that. In the third mission, this mission was entirely about extracting items. There were some options in there as well, but the main idea behind it is that if you had obtained items on the field, you could either keep those items at your base, and at an event you get scoreable points for them. Or in this mission, you could take a chance of ferrying those items over to these black clad troopers and hand them to them. You know, the risk being, of course, that if you were to, you know, lose those guys along the way, you might lose your items. The secondary risk on that was that both sides were given a trapdoor option. If they wanted to, they could plant a bomb amongst their items. And essentially, if they did that, they could blow up that shipment of everything and deny both teams points. Which, if you were, say, for example, only submitting one low value item with a bomb on it, you could severely damage the other team should you succeed at this. Both sides ended up picking the kind of the beneficial option for themselves, which is that they both look to extract items. In the breakdown for this one, which is over here, actually, you can see it. Both sides actually did extract 5 items each. The difference was the value of the points themselves. Because these were scored triple points, basically the TFA extracted three very valuable items. They did their own faction items and mission items, which are scored higher than general items, while the rebels were more conservative and did only general items. So TFA came out pretty much on top here, but again, it's a 225 to 150, so both teams did pretty well scoring wise. In the final mission, the final normal story mission here that has a point value established for it. This was the artillery game where essentially the TFA could fire their artillery gun as many times as they found artillery rounds on the field. They managed to find 4 of the total 5 rounds that they could fire. So they did manage to fire it 4 times, which netted them 40 points. However, the rebels, in response to TFA, did capture one of the locations to slow down the damage being done to the colony. So they did manage to kind of net a point value of that. So from a mission total standpoint, it was a TFA won out by 420 to 275. Now in the general resource game, at the end of the day, the rebels held on to one more item that was slightly more valuable than the items that the TFA held on to, which netted them a small little etching out here, 30 to 35 points for the items held resources. Now on the ground game, this is where it gets interesting. Both sides were really balanced all day. They managed to hold on to their side's points, battling a lot over the center. And you can see in here, these are the 3 points that were the most valuable. So every point here was, aside from these 3, is a single point value, while as motel, comms cabin, and town hall were double value for every minute you held on to them. So extremely good. And you can see here, they kind of were fighting back and forth a bunch for these, especially on comms cabin and town hall, in terms of the minutes displayed here. Everything else is pretty much blanketed here. The rebels did manage to kind of upset a little bit on a few of these, which is why you actually notice discrepancy here, where basically TFA had netted on base value 1,044 points from locations, while the rebels did 1,063. However, in terms of double value, the rebels pulled ahead significantly with 1,360 to 1,454 points. Now, so they basically, it's kind of interesting from like a story perspective that the rebels did have, they did better on the control aspect of it, which is somewhat, again, true to this whole engagement. The TFA were very much locked down in their areas of control, but the rebels seem to be able to flow and move about the field more freely and causing, kind of indiscriminate damage throughout the game. So it was, and again, these are very close values, but you could see it in the actual, like, kind of how the event played through and what the story was about, that this seemed to make a lot of sense. Now, in terms of, again, a purely point-based game, the totals that they come out to, very, very close. depending on how you might twist or change some of these mechanics, you could always, put your thumb down on the scale or what have you. But I didn't want to mess with it too much. I left it pretty much exactly as we had written, to make it a fair game in my mind. The one thing that, people may be surprised by is that the fifth mission, which was the scenario where the TFA had to attack into the town while the rebels had to defend, was not ever considered to be a true scoreable engagement, because it wasn't. It was not exactly a. One of the things about that engagement that I was doing when I kind of came up with some of it, I obviously talked this over with Anthony and Frowny a bit too. Was I wanted to try a ghost town with only one floor, like just the single one story across the bottom, and see how that played out in terms of engagement. And I think there's a way to make that work, but I don't think it was I never thought of it as like a fair thing to say, hey guys, let's score you based on this thing we haven't tried before. Let's see how you do. Yeah. By the way, though, if you don't get it right because it's unfair or what have you, it doesn't matter. You're not going to get you're going to get scored off. No, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to score it. It was it was definitely a case where let's see how this goes, and then it's going to open up to this major story event, which is the Black Tide basically deciding whether by a corporate mandate or what have you, don't know, that they were going to betray everybody. That was what that was going to be about in the end. No matter what happened, not everything we write is done in a way where we don't plan everything necessarily down. We kind of put the pieces in place, and then we move the game to suit what the players are doing, because that's the best way to respond. Sometimes if you're too rigid with your games, sometimes what will happen is people are going to get really mad because it's just not fun, because it's not responding to what the reality is on the ground. And the reality of what was happening was the town was a bloodbath. Both teams were slaughtering each other, but there was never going to be a real victor out of that. It was going to be too tough an objective to crack, especially from an attacker's perspective. When you limit the way you can get into that town and you don't build up enough stuff for them to be able to get in with it, I mean, the casualties speak for themselves. TFA took extreme casualties trying to get in there. So long-winded saying, fifth mission didn't count, wasn't going to, if anyone was wondering about that. The final scores, as I ramble around here, are TFA came out to 1810 and the Rebels came out to 1764. Again, very, very close game. That's a 50-point spread. There were penalties in this game. There wasn't anything where anyone got subtracted for anything in particular. That this was, again, purely from here are your missions, here's how they work, go. I think there's a lot of things that could, again, like you push it one way or another, you could change these totals. Like if again, we had more structure for that, a little more communications for a lot of these squads. Like they could have, really ground these down a bit more. But I cannot stress this enough. I'm really happy that what I saw on the playing field shows through on the scoreboard in terms of like just how close these two teams were fighting each other. It's an impressive thing to see it kind of all lined up. It doesn't always happen that way, but for the first time coming back to this and seeing this kind of play out the way it did, I'm really happy with it. And so yeah, again, thanks for listening. I hope that this was fun for you guys. I will work to make these better as we make more of these things and talk about them. Feel free to throw in some comments. Hey, Will, like maybe don't talk so much next time. I have things to do with my day or what have you. Just drop me a note. Feel free to talk to me. I will be happy to respond. And I will talk to you guys later.